Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran and I'm Director of Reform Scotland, and welcome to this Reform Scotland election discussion. I could call it a debate, but you know, here at Reform Scotland we like to shed more light than heat and be a bit on the policy side rather than the hard and fast politics. So I think it'll be a discussion and hopefully a very well-mannered one. I think all our guests are so knackered anyway that they've probably got no shouting left in them, so we've probably timed it quite well. There are, as you know, 3 days left until Britain goes to the polls after what has felt like a very, very long election campaign. And after all that, the likely result looks like being just what it did when we set out on this journey, which is, I guess, a substantial Labour majority, according to pretty much every poll you see, really with just the final numbers to be decided. In Scotland, obviously, the scrap between Labour and the SNP has been pretty ferocious, with seats across the central belt back in play after a long period in which the Nationalists have held those seats. And this will determine which of them is Scotland's largest party at Westminster, and I guess holds the momentum going into Holyrood 2026. We're watching the Conservatives to see which direction they're going to take after what looks like an inevitable defeat on Thursday. And certainly with populists once more on the rise across many Western democracies, will the Tories be able to resist a Faragist turn? I'm sure many of us hope that they will, but I don't think that's written in yet. And also, will Ed Davey's energetic election campaign, coupled maybe with the return of voters in the southwest of England and elsewhere, help put the Lib Dems back in the game? It's been a while, really, since they were in power with the Conservatives at Westminster, and they've been living with the legacy of that ever since. Their election campaign has felt a bit different this time for a number of reasons, but also I think with perhaps the end of 14 years of Conservative government, they're getting something of a hearing that they haven't had for a while. And in the end, for us in Scotland, what's it all going to mean for our economy and our public services, for Holyrood's relationship with Westminster, the devolved election of 2026, which is obviously going to follow quite quickly on the heels of this general election. And let's not forget the future of the Union. How could we forget? We're never allowed to forget. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, I'm delighted to say that we have a panel of Scotland's most senior and respected politicians with us today to discuss all of this. So joining us in no particular order are Kate Forbes of the SNP, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Daniel Johnson of Labour, who is Shadow Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Lord Offord, Malcolm Offord of the Conservatives, is a former Scotland Office Minister and is in his final days, if I can put it that way, as Under Secretary of State for... Oh, could you mute yourself, please, if you're not one of the panellists, so we don't hear you hooting out, because that's quite off-putting. That would be great. Yeah, as I say, Malcolm Offord, Under Secretary of State for Exports in the Conservative government, and Willie Rennie of the Liberal Democrats, who is a spokesperson for education, the economy and communities. So I thought the best way to do this would be for me to ask a few questions of each of them individually to get the ball rolling, and then we'll move to a general discussion amongst the guests. But as always, we really, really want to hear your questions. So if you can send them through using the Zoom chat toggle, and we'll select the best of them to put to the panel. That would be the best way to do it. So thank you for that. And as I say, if you're not on the panel, can you please mute yourself so we don't get interrupted? So Daniel, I said I'd start with you, so that's what I'm going to do. Your party looks to be standing on the cusp of power, which is something I can say, even if you're not ready to say it yet. I'm sure you're still being super cautious, as is the way of these things. But, you know, it's a big moment for the Labour Party, this, and a big moment for Scottish Labour after a fair amount of years in something approaching the political wilderness, at least by the Labour Party's lights in Scotland. So a fairly easy question to start with, but an important one. What will a Keir Starmer government mean for Scotland in those first 2 years?
I mean, can I actually begin by saying, Chris, that following that announcement, or your introduction rather, I should say that not a single ballot has been counted, and I don't think we can take anything for granted. And I think if anything, you know, if we look at politics more broadly over the last few days, you know, whether it's the US with a faltering president in the presidential debates, or in France with the result we just had the weekend, I mean, really, I think while things may look like they are heading in a particular direction in the United Kingdom, I think the lesson is that in today's politics, wherever you are in the Western world, things can change very quickly. And I think that does lead on into your question. I mean, I think what we will see from a Starmer government is a much cooler-headed, pragmatic approach to government, one clearly led by a plan. It's not by accident that we have led with 6 clear missions. We have set a manifesto which is very much about the first steps of a government, because we recognise the difficulty of the economic circumstances, that should we be privileged enough to form a government that we be inheriting. But I think what we would see is, first of all, a dramatic change in tone from the current government, one that I think is much franker, one that is more candid about the issues that we face, rather than a government that I think has frankly sought to, I think, lean in to things like culture wars. And then ultimately, it is one that, albeit constrained by the public finances that we are going to inherit, one that very much looks to invest and build the economy based on sound economic principles, but also grounded in things like GB Energy, a national infrastructure fund, and one that very much recognises the changed economic circumstances, not just in terms of the constraint, but the fact that we are seemingly, I think, moving away from a more globalised global economy to one which may be about multipolar world, one which I think we are going to see a kind of a rise of a divide in the world between the US and China, and one where, as Rachel Reeves frames it, securonomics is going to become a much bigger feature. So I think these are some of the features and themes that I would expect to see from a Starmer government, and one that I think ultimately I would expect to see the benefits of in terms of investment and public expenditure in Scotland, albeit constrained by the public finances we'd be inheriting.
I suppose that's one of the issues, Daniel, is that if you look at the Scottish electorate and its tendency to vote along centre-left lines for many decades, really, in majority form anyway, that they've been waiting, these people have been waiting on a Labour government for, the last 14 years, I guess, and we're probably hoping that with that arrival of a Labour government, that the approach of the government would change, and that it wouldn't feel like the straightened rules of the Conservatives would be continued. It would feel like there would be proper investment in public services. Your opposition from the left in Scotland certainly has been saying this quite a bit. Isn't there a possibility that people are going to be quite disappointed then when Starmer comes in and actually the purse strings are held every bit as tightly or as close to as tightly as they've been held by the Conservatives?
Well, look, we've had the experiment in the United Kingdom of what happens if you have a government that makes commitments without going through the rigour of the financial assessment from the OBR, that makes pledges that are uncosted and unfunded, and it led to the biggest single jump in the cost of borrowing for the United Kingdom in a single day since Black Wednesday. So, do we run that risk? Yes. Are we being cautious? Yes, but that's simply because we cannot afford to make commitments and pledges which we cannot point to where the funding will come from, and I think that's really important. But we will be substantially different in other ways. We'll be a government, should we be elected, that will seek to invest in our infrastructure, that will seek to ensure that we accelerate investment in renewables, and I think that could have substantial benefits for Scotland in, for example, additional investment in our port infrastructure, which is really needed to sort of bridge the gap between our existing energy footprint and things like floating offshore wind and others. So there will be a difference. Will it be as much of a difference as we would want? No, but we have to be realists. We have to make commitments that we can see through. Ones that it's not just about, it's not about kind of fiscal rules. It's actually ultimately what will the markets tolerate? Because what we can't do is have commitments that are uncosted, unfunded, because the markets would savage the country if we did so.
Okay, and just last question for now, Daniel, but what kind of representation will Scottish MPs have in this government, do you think? Because one of the issues that's been raised with me, and it's something I've thought for a while, actually because the SNP have held the most seats and they're not in government at Westminster, is that inevitably the front bench of both the Scottish Labour Party, the Labour Party and the Conservatives, has been very, very English, because that's largely where they've had to draw their pool of MPs from. We know that the Blair government, the Brown government, the Thatcher government for that matter, major government, there was a lot of Scots in all of these administrations, and it probably helped the British Parliament feel like it was more representative of Scots and had them in big jobs. So what are we talking about in terms of cabinet jobs for Scottish MPs, almost all of whom will be new, or junior ministerial jobs? What would you expect to see coming
Well,
out of
look,
it?
can I just say, I'm still waiting on the call from Keir Starmer as to who he should appoint to our front bench after the election. But, just that notwithstanding, I mean, what I would say is we've got actually quite a remarkable set of candidates who I think at least could win. We've got, people like Kirsty McNeil, who has both been an advisor in Number 10, but also the executive director of Save the Children. We have people like Martin McCluskey through Inverclyde, who again I think is an absolutely first-rate mind and somebody who's been at the heart of policymaking in Westminster. So I would hope that Keir does look at the talent that we have and ensure that those people are in position. And I would expect to see a much better representation on the government benches, from Scotland than we've seen in recent years, and I think that will make a difference, because I think there's a saying that certain parties have liked to use in recent times about carping from the sidelines. I think there's a real opportunity to have MPs, Scottish Labour MPs, elected from Scotland at the heart of government, and that's what I'd fully expect to see.
Okay, thank you for just now, Daniel. Kate, move on to you next. We've watched this campaign, and obviously you've been in office again now for the last couple of months, along with John Swinney, your leader. And I suppose, and I hope this doesn't sound unkind, but it feels like maybe what should be said about this still quite new leadership is that you've managed to bottom things out, that the SNP aren't necessarily rising in the polls, but they are no longer sinking. And it did feel for a while like things were heading south at an increasingly fast rate. That's not nothing, obviously, and that the first thing is to stop the rot, if I could put it that way. But you're still going to lose a bunch of seats on Thursday, aren't you?
Well, I think it's a fair characterisation to say that the polls have stabilised, and to echo Daniel, nobody knows what's going to happen until Friday morning, essentially. But certainly that characterisation and the statistics in the poll echoes what I am hearing when I am going out door knocking with people. There's some that definitely won't vote for us. There's some that definitely will vote for us, and there's a group in the middle that basically have a conversation that goes along the lines of, I wasn't going to vote because I'm not inspired. I'm feeling a wee bit hurt by what's happened in my normal party of support, the SNP, and I'm not inspired by Labour. But I want to give John Swinney a chance. And that is the conversation that happens quite a lot. And when you get a chance to speak to them, they nearly always say, right, I'll give you a chance. But I think that echoes what you're seeing on a macro level in those micro conversations. I think there's two interesting things from that. The first is that John Swinney genuinely has, in uniting the party, presented a more stable front that people can trust and have confidence in. And secondly, the most important one for me is that they haven't en masse been inspired by Labour. I'm talking about that middle group, clearly. That varies across the country. So, I'm currently in a seat that Willie Rennie is very keen to hold on to because it's facing off to the Lib Dems. The bottom half of my seat is facing off to the Tories. The other part of my seat is hopefully going to be held by Drew Henry. So we're focused very much on the fact that so many seats are on a knife edge in Glasgow, but from that perspective, the SNP as a national party, we really are contesting every seat across the country in a way that perhaps Labour is concentrated more in Glasgow. And as John Swinney said last week, in a sense, Labour's victory is a foregone conclusion in England. In Scotland, pretty much every seat is knife edge. And anybody who has run a campaign knows that actually good organisation, when things are so tight in a first past the post system, can make the difference. But it really is in those really fine margins, which is why we are giving it all we've got.
And I certainly noticed, and both in the manifesto and also I think in the campaign launch, that the language that was being used by the First Minister, certainly, and I'm sure yourself and your colleagues as well, has changed from what we were used to under his predecessors. So the word moderate is never far away from his mouth. Mainstream centre-left. There's a reason John Swinney keeps telling us this. That's because he has to, because he feels that there's a need to say that explicitly to voters. Could you tell us a bit about how the SNP has changed in the last couple of months, and how does that reflect the fact that I suppose the cabinet, other than you, really is pretty much the same cabinet that we've had under, you know, the predecessors who weren't necessarily talking about being moderate or centrist or mainstream or whatever. Certainly their actions didn't always come across that way.
Yeah, so first of all, this election was always inevitably, I think, going to be focused in that area for the one reason that a Butte House Agreement doesn't apply in an election. But I suppose the difference is that that language started prior to the election, and perhaps some of us would have preferred it if that language had been used considerably before the election was called, just to be really clear, because it is difficult to set out your stall in an election whilst also, as it were, under new leadership. And it's the only reason I went back into government. You know, I really must be clear that I had a choice as to whether to, I suppose bluntly, to contest the leadership, not to contest the leadership, or to go and support John Swinney. And the reason I supported him is because I was inspired by the fact his politics, particularly around the economy, were very consistent with mine, which is that all those things you care about, tackling child poverty, reaching net zero, resilient public services, you can't do any of them without a growing economy. And we have to own that and be proud of that. It's sustainable growth, but you have to be proud of that. And how do you deliver growth? Well, it's focusing on your industries, it's focusing on your strengths, it's trying to resolve some of the hurdles. And perhaps, you know, I wouldn't say this in most hustings, but I do think that this Thursday presents an opportunity to do things differently. It's well documented that the relationship between both governments had really disintegrated to such an extent that if you take an issue like the economy, which cuts across reserved and devolved lines like nothing else does, you know, we may want to increase imports and exports, but actually we need to work closely with Malcolm because he is responsible for setting what happens on the border. So I think there is a big opportunity to reset the relationship and be a lot more constructive with the incoming government to start out on the right foot and talk about, look, what will it mean for freedom of movement, immigration? That proposal we've had on your desk for months of a Scotland-specific visa, can we make progress on that? You know, what does it mean for our capital investment? If we're going to build our way out of these really difficult times and crack the productivity nut, can we see more investment in capital? And the same goes with our relationship with Europe. So I do think that there's an opportunity. In the previous era, I think positive and constructive engagement was noticeable by its rarity. And it would be very nice to get to the point where it's the norm.
And coming out of this election and after recess, we'll be looking to your programme of government for evidence of action as opposed to rhetoric, you know, even in the early days. So
Absolutely.
A lot to say, but we're now kind of waiting with bated breath to see whether this programme of government might offer more meat than perhaps has been in previous programmes of government in recent years in the areas that you're talking about. Now, you're in charge of the economy, so you can talk about Westminster and what you'd like to see there and how you'd like to. But what can as much as you can tell us, what can we expect to see on the economy for a devolved parliament, the programme of government that will come after the summer?
Well, it was a particular frustration because, you know, when you come in, you're wanting to keep that momentum going, you're wanting to accelerate progress, and then to be hit by Purda has been quite a frustration. So there's an opportunity over summer to reignite that momentum. I'll give you my 4 really brief priorities, but the core theme of our work on the economy is less writing, more doing. That's it. John Swinney's owned that. He's been clear about that. So what does that mean for me? Well, first of all, our public finances are under enormous strain. They just are. And, you know, Labour will soon see just how horrendous it is. So therefore, private finance has got to be the answer to a lot of our challenges. It's the only answer to net zero, the big component required for building affordable housing, and so on. So I think, and I've said clear I've been clear with officials, it's this point around private investment that we need to make it as easy as possible, remove the hurdles. Secondly, it's on tech. Daniel and I, and Willie as well, have had a lot of conversations on tech, and I often think that the reason we've made so much progress on tech is that it's not a political football. And with the tech scalers trying to get startups, then growing into scale-ups, and I know that we have cross-party support on that. And then thirdly, there's this problem with workforce. In other words, the labour market is still tight. We've got high levels of inactivity. That would be the third thing to crack. And then the last one is net zero. So the opportunities are just enormous. We're going to get the value of those opportunities in Scotland, but it will be accidentally and not by design if we don't put in place the policies that actively attract the investment, engage with potential investors who have an international mindset, and get them investing. And they are. I'm looking right at, for example, where Sumitomo is about to invest £350 million in the cable factory. And that came about through careful engagement at ministerial and official level. And then we did what they needed in order to make it an attractive option for them. So there's my 4 things. I'm not going to write them in a strategy, but they are what I would like to make progress on in the next 2 years.
Okay, thank you for that. Moving on to Malcolm. Malcolm, you chose to go into politics after a long and very successful career in business. And other people have done that in the past, some with more success than others, some have enjoyed it more than others, but certainly it can't have been easy being a Conservative minister in recent years. I'm sure there've been moments where you might have liked to fire some of your colleagues. Had they been working for you, you'd have run out of patience with them long before. What are your reflections as it looks like you may be coming to the end of your time in government, and what the experience has been like, certainly over the last couple of years?
Well, if I just start on that on a personal level, it's a very different environment, clearly, politics from business, because you can't tell people what to do in politics, but you can in business, right? So it's a very different skill set. When I came in, Alistair Jack said to me, look, there's no guarantee you'll be any good at this, Malcolm, right? So, he said, but if you are, you'll get poached. That was actually what happened. So I got poached by Kemi Badenoch after 2 years. But I did 2 years in Scotland office, and then 1 year in Department of Trade. But there are certain consistent themes that do relate quite closely to business. And in this election was a record number of people undecided. I mean, my own door knocking, I've been out and about myself doing campaigning, and whether I'm talking to Labour voters or Conservative voters or SNP voters, there's a general sort of disillusionment with the current state of the parties. And they feel that they are not getting their priorities met. And I think interesting that a great number of undecideds, the big issues is around public services. And the argument now is, how do you pay for those? And so this word growth is the word that is perhaps the word that's being used most in this election. If I look now from the benefit of being inside government at growth, what does growth mean? Because at the end of the day, we've just come through a rotten 5 years, the worst 5 years in the world economy since the Second World War. Right? That's not local, that's global. I remember one of my trade visits, I went to Australia for the FTA trade deal, and I was sitting in Australian Parliament in the equivalent of their question time on a Tuesday afternoon. The topics of conversation were energy prices, inflation, immigration, cost of living, exactly the same, word for word. Supply chain issues with China, word for word, the same as what we have in this country. These are global winds that have buffeted us. And to be fair, thank goodness for the strength of sterling. Thank goodness for the Treasury. We spent 400 billion on 300 on COVID and 100 on the cost of living, paying everyone's energy bills through the last 18 months. We've used the strength of sterling to get through that, and we've come through. In the meantime, however, our credit card has been maxed out. We're now 100% of GDP. Our debt service, our interest payments on our credit card in 21 were 20 million. This year, they're 100 million. And so we've got big issues in terms of the economy. And what people want to know then is, how do you get growth? Because we can't borrow more, we can't taxes are at an all-time high, borrowing's at an all-time high. How do we service these valuable public services? Now, it was Nigel Lawson, wasn't it, that said, but growth is not created by politicians, it's created by people. The politician's job is to create the right environment for growth. And wasn't it Bill Clinton that said that when it comes to an undecided decision in an election, it's all about the economy, stupid? I think the next 3 days, people are going to look really closely at who can provide an economy that can grow to provide the scope for our public services. And I think that's where I think the emphasis will be in the next few days.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose looking just slightly beyond that, and something that comes back to what you were saying there about the winds that have been buffeting us all. We've watched in France, we're watching in the States, we've seen it in Sweden and Finland and many other countries, that the sort of populist right has found a credibility with voters that has led them into government, actually, in lots of cases. We see that Farage looks likely to perhaps win in Clacton. There have been entreaties made from certain aspects of the Conservative Party that if that happens, that he might come into the party, etc. One of the things about the British system, I suppose, that in the first past the post system, as much as you can criticise aspects of it, is that it has kept the extremes out of politics. I mean, your sense from within the Conservative Party, is it that we are moving towards a post-election party that might start to look at some of this populist stuff and think there's clearly a direction of travel here that's going to be politically successful over the next period? Let's have a bit of that.
I'm not picking up that sort of rhetoric at this point. I think people are very focused on trying to get, to get as best result as we can. But look, there's no question that going forward, these modern economies, the G7 economies, you take away the US and Canada, they're the growing number 1 and 2. We're growing at third, so we're growing ahead of the other European economies. So it's not a lot of growth, but at least it's ahead, right? And we're turning the corner. We are turning the corner now. I mean, my portfolio in trade, got a massive bounce back in trade, massive bounce backs in exports, which are actually going gangbusters in certain areas. And we're really getting the benefits of the Brexit deals we're doing now with the trade deals we're striking around the world. There's a lot of good stuff coming through. The issue is that when you've got growth, low growth, and then pressure on public services, there tends to be a bit of a safety valve that goes off, and the valve that is being pushed at the moment in Europe is the immigration valve. People are saying that there's too many people coming into these countries, and we've got pressure on public services. We haven't had that much in the UK, but there is no doubt that what Farage has done, he put us 97, there was 2.5 million came in under Blair, and there's been 4 million coming under the Conservatives. So there's been a big increase in people coming into our country, most of whom contribute greatly to our economy. But that creates a narrative that where public services are stretched, so you can't get to see a GP, and hospital times that waiting lists are an all-time record high. You can see how that narrative gets joined up. My view on this is that we need to keep this debate pretty civilized. We all want a controlled immigration system. Interestingly, I read the S&P Independent paper in 2014, which wants a points-based immigration system, which is what's now being introduced. So I think we're all in consensus on that. And we all want to protect our public services. How do we therefore get growth? And that really is about incentive. If growth is driven by people, not by politicians, and if human nature works on incentive, we need to give businesses and people incentives to grow. And if you're going to put taxes up, that is a disincentive to growth. We need to create wealth. We need an agenda that says we need to create wealth for the benefit of everybody, but that basically the incentive to create wealth for you and your family will benefit the rest of the economy, it will benefit the country as a whole. And therefore the debate needs to be about, do you think which party in available to you on Thursday is going to give you an incentive to work harder, to get back into work, to grow the economy, or put taxes up or increase borrowing? And that, I think, will come down to the economic decision, which I think people are going to make on Thursday.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. So Willie, the first question I have to ask you is possibly a less serious one, but I do wonder, you are famously the action man campaigner from your days as leader of the Scottish Lib Dems, and I wonder if there's anything you've looked at Ed Davey doing and thought, I wouldn't have done that, or would you have gone for it on all of it? Would you have been hanging off a budget up today?
He's not even touched the sides.
I like it. We miss those days. I suppose the thing I'd like to ask you is that, as I said in the intro, your party has, in a sense, been struggling for credibility, or at least reach, since the coalition with Cameron's Conservatives. The arguments at the time were strong for doing it. Equally, the consequences since have been pretty severe, both up here and down at Westminster. Is your sense that after 14 years of Conservative government, as things move on, probably get enough time for your party to maybe shift a bit back towards the centre-left, or at least be seen as being back there that this is the election, that point is changing. Have people forgiven you at last for that decision, and are we going to see that on Thursday?
I think a lot have. I think some haven't and might never. It depends on how you were affected personally by it. You know, if you paid tuition fees in England, that's felt a bit sorer. But an awful lot of people, it's going into the past, and we're finding we're getting a better hearing at this election. And particularly in the south and southwest, you'll have seen quite significant predictions of gains down there. So it feels different this time. I don't think it's felt, in fact, Jamie Stone up in Caithness was telling me the other day, it's not felt this good since 2007. He puts pre-coalition period as that. Even 2010 wasn't as good as this, according to him. We're always a wee bit nervous because you start off well at the start of campaigns and then it fades. But this time round, it seems to have sustained itself. But I think the others are right. There's quite a lot of people who are undecided. People who have been SNP for quite some time have really been shaken, their foundations. They don't quite know where to go. And some of them have moved already. Perhaps some of them might move back because of John. I'm not coming an awful lot of people that are in that category, but there are some. There's no doubt about that. But the overwhelming feeling is that change, it's whether it's change from the Conservatives or change from the SNP. And it depends on where you are as to how strong that is felt. And we are benefiting significantly from that in our top target seats in Scotland, where actually I have to say, I've not felt the anger about the SNP that I have in this campaign for some time. There was a bit post the Brexit referendum when Nicola went a bit nuts and arguing for independence straight away again. There was a lot of anger at that time, but this is more than that. So I think the tactical voting this time round will be significant.
Interesting. And looking again beyond this election, and we're obviously going to tumble quite quickly into the Holyrood election, and it's been quite noticeable in the Scottish leaders' debates that relations between Nanis Sarwar and Alex Cole-Hamilton seem to be quite warm. You know, if they're not quite making eyes at each other across the stage, there's definitely a sense that they are starting to cozy up to one another. Is your sense that what we've seen in this election, which to a large extent across the UK has been get the Tories out, that when we come to 2026, it will be a get the SNP out, and actually the unionist parties, if I can call them that, are likely to start to talk to one another, and you know, you guys will be, and Labour will be looking at some kind of coalition. I know I'm getting far ahead here, but it feels like a kind of obvious.
I mean, it's the very. I mean, we get on very well. We sit next to each other in the chamber, and there are differences, significant differences. But in the context of, you know, a period since, well, pre-2014, where I think politics has been reaching for easy, sometimes extreme solutions, whether that's independence, Brexit, Liz Truss's budget, Boris Johnson, I think a period of stability. Visibility into the future for business to understand where the country's going, and for that to be sustained and consistent, not chopping and changing all the time, not constant announcements about, you know, slight tweaks in policy. It's got to be a consistent plan over a long period of time in order for businesses to be able to make the investment, develop the skills, make sure they've got the plans in place. You know, boring things like making sure that the planning system for renewables is invested in so that the businesses know that it's worth the candle to spend time and money on investing in facilities. So making sure that all of that's in place, which for many people is, you know, is quite minutiae, but that's just not been happening in recent years. And partnership between the governments. I mean, we've never really managed to crack it. I mean, in the kind of the Brown-Salmond period, that the relations then were a bit ropey. David Cameron made a serious attempt, I think, at trying to forge a better relationship, a more kind of, what was it, mutual respect, I think was what we called it at the time. And that worked for a period until the independence referendum came along, and then that blew that up. But trust has really been broken. It's tested. And I have to say, the fault's on both sides. You know, even when we were in government, there was a problem where you didn't quite trust what the others were going to do. And we can't afford to do that when we're trying to get economic growth. We need to have a more respectful relationship. So no undercutting each other, no announcing things just in advance of the other government. Let's try and work in a more mature partnership basis. Because actually, people vote not on whether our press release is better than theirs. People vote on what they feel. Have they got a job? Can they afford to heat their house? Have they got a decent house to live in? That's what people vote on. And as soon as we realise that it's not about a PR war, it's about how people feel, then we've got a better chance of doing all our jobs an awful lot better. But that's just not been happening. It's just been constant chopping and changing and arguing. And people just want a bit of pragmatism now, I think. And that's why I think, I mean, you've noticed that how I described the situation there was not too dissimilar from what Daniel started off describing, because I think we both understand that that bit of stability is really important after a period of chaos. And that's where we need to work together. And that means making sure we've got a good relationship with Kate and John, that we can actually try to do the job that we're elected to do.
Okay, well,
Willie, I think we can both agree. The important element in terms of that relationship between Labour and Lib Dems, it's all about you and me, not about Anas and Alex, right?
Yeah. This is where the power is, Daniel.
We heard it here first. There's a coup underway. I like it. Just on that working together, and something Malcolm raised about immigration, which obviously is a different type of debate down south than it is up here, as I often put it, because we don't really have very much immigration up here, and we'd like more of it. And it seems like all of the parties, from right to left at the Scottish Parliament, are keen for greater immigration. So that idea of working together, that it's been mooted. We've done it as a think tank, mooted that a separate Scottish visa would be more likely to make a proper difference on this than perhaps revisiting the Fresh Talent Initiative. I know that we're talking about a Fresh Talent Initiative. It seems like everybody thinks that would be a good way to start. But Kate, for example, you, I think, have talked about a separate visa. And I know Jackie Bailey said some stuff at the weekend which may or may not have been helpful to you, Daniel, and maybe you could come back on that. But Kate, could you just talk a bit about the impact that you think something like that might have? Because immigration isn't a silver bullet, but nevertheless, it seems like something that could make a difference to our demographic issues.
Absolutely. And I think that it's an area where the cross-party consensus in the Scottish Parliament has really stood out against perhaps the negative rhetoric in other parts of the United Kingdom. So we know, first of all, that it is possible to have a Scotland-specific visa or immigration policy. It works in a federal place like Canada, where they managed to do it. So I don't think you have to have strong views on the Constitution to think that more devolution is a good thing. The second thing is identifying the need. And I really cannot tell you how desperate the sense is for greater immigration in parts of Scotland. I guess I'm in the Highlands, and we have particularly acute issues with depopulation. So while people say, well, look at your labour market policies more generally around inactivity, okay, we need to focus on that. But right now, I have, over the last few weeks, visited a number of food and drink businesses. It's the biggest export hub for Scottish salmon. They're desperate. What's really sad in a debate where everybody is looking at the greater potential in the Scottish economy is that a lot of these businesses say it's not our ambition, it's not our product or our service, it's not our ability, it's that we physically are constrained by the number of workers. And that came through to me certainly on Friday. I was in Saltcoats and visiting a meat processor there. They were telling me about the costs now. 5 years ago, the costs to bring in labour from outside the UK were X. Now they're talking about, you're talking about 25, I'm not going to actually, I probably shouldn't divulge their own costs in terms of it being confidential, but its figures are just going through the roof. So I think we need something specific. And I do think that there is a more positive approach to immigration, which makes sense because our country, if we've known anything, it has been the curse of emigration. And I think that there's a lot of space and there's a welcome too.
Okay, Daniel, could you come back on that, but not for too long, because I'm just aware of the time, and I would like to get the audience to involved.
So let me say three things. I mean, Jackie's absolutely right, but actually Jackie's intervention was just repeating things that we had been saying previously about really being very serious about revisiting the Fresh Talent scheme. It's not just that you need to look to Canada to see how devolved visa schemes can work. We've made it work here before. But I would also say that when you go a little bit further, look, there are some longer term trends here as well in terms of global demographics. So I think absolutely we need to try and make sure that we get people here that we need here. But we also need to actually think very seriously about how we organize an economy where there are more people beyond working age than of working age. Because actually the reality is that global demographics, global population growth is going to slow. And therefore there's going to be an increasing war for talent. And that's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. Then the final thing is, and especially thinking about what Peter Matheson has said in the chat, we also need to look about how universities can be a source of economic growth. Now, we can talk about that in lots of different ways, but this is in a really important way. What happened with the post-study work visas is an absolute nonsense. To actually have people coming here, bright people, able people, and then actually losing them from our economy. Our universities are one of our key strategic economic assets, and I don't think we're making the most of them. And in particular, that ability to draw people to this country, we should be actually seeking to leverage that, not push people away once they've studied here.
Okay. Just one quick last question from me for Malcolm and Willie, and just so we can get you involved. I keep hearing people talking about Manchester, as I'm sure as many people in business do, and what Andy Burnham's doing there, and what's happening to its economy. And we contrast that with Glasgow. There's a new report out today about its retail footfall, about its empty shops, the struggles that it's having. And it seems odd that you can do one thing in Manchester, which starts to rehabilitate that city, and we can't do the same in Glasgow. Now it's really a question for Holyrood as to the political control of Glasgow, or the mechanisms for Glasgow. Malcolm, what do you see when you're sort of looking at Manchester and this, and not just Manchester but Birmingham and other places? Manchester seems to be the poster child.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Englandshire actually in the last year, and I've been in all the English cities, and I've been in Manchester. I met with Andy Burnham, and I've been very impressed with what he's doing. He's embraced. He works with the Westminster government on every level. He embraces that relationship. He's not an adversarial relationship. He's out to try and get the best from Manchester every time. And so, for example, we're doing all these state MOUs with the US states. He's all over that. And then I've got some responsibility I did have for the Osaka Expo next year. He's all over that because Manchester got a historical relationship with Osaka. So there's nothing, my immediate point is there's nothing that can be done in Manchester that can't be done in Glasgow. But if I just come to the immigration point just very quickly, just to push back a little bit on why we might want to think twice about just how we do this, about having separate migration systems. Because the UK obviously acts as has to have one entity for immigration. And I would say, over the last 25 years we've had devolution, Scotland hasn't been able to get its fair share of immigration coming to the UK, right? And you're going to ask yourself, why is that, right? And we have to ask the Scottish politicians why they haven't made it more attractive. And perhaps it's back to incentive. And if I was coming to the UK now and I say, is that the part of the UK with the highest tax rates and where the education system has gone from outstanding to average, maybe that's not such a good place to be. But one other thing, I think there's something morally questionable for us about stealing talent from other countries. Another of my trade visits 3 weeks ago was in Mozambique. They've got an amazing opportunity it's 30 million people, they've got an amazing opportunity to revolutionize their country, mainly through energy, through a hybrid of gas, hydro, solar, renewable green hydrogen, right? And they need technical people to help them do that. And if we just nick all their best people because we need them instead, I don't think that is the right way to go forward, especially when we have 20% of our own people not working. We need to get our own people back to work. We need to have a conversation about how we get folks back to work, about the hidden unemployment that the Centre for Cities report last year, I advise you to look at that, demonstrates that 16% hidden unemployment in Dundee, Aberdeen, and Glasgow. When there are amazing opportunities in the new 21st century industries in which Scotland's all over, whether it's renewables, whether it's digital fintech, whether it's creative industries, whether it's advanced manufacturing, whether it's life sciences, Scotland has a leading place in all of those, led by the universities, as Peter has said. And we're not in the business of just nicking the best talent from overseas. We need to get our own people educated, skilled up, trained, and back to work. And when I was up in the rural communities, Kate, and I was up in Stornoway, and I was meeting the kids from Nicholson Institute and talking to them, just having done their hires, about how they reckon they would be back in the island within 5 years. And their parents weren't able to do that. They had to be away for 25 years. You went back to retire, back to Stornoway. Now they are looking around and seeing the biggest wind farms in Europe. They're seeing the whole fish farming thing. They're seeing the life sciences thing. They've got real opportunities. So here's the thing. Why can't we incentivize people to come to those areas where there are real good jobs by improving the housing, the schools, the roads, the day-to-day stuff that it would seem that the Hollywood politicians don't want to deal with. They want to talk about Westminster issues. Let's get the domestic issues sorted out. We've got a great opportunity to grow our economy in Scotland.
Right. Willie, you're famously a localist party, and we're ahead of the game on a lot of this stuff that we're now seeing happening down south, actually, even if it's not quite happening up here. What's your view of what should happen to Scotland's cities in terms of the way that they're run? Because it does feel like they are somewhat underpowered compared to the dynamism that we're seeing elsewhere.
The one politician I thought that was on the road to resolving the city's issue was Stephen Purcell when he was in charge of Glasgow. I thought he was a strong personality. Unfortunately, had some personal difficulties, but he actually, I thought, had the potential of building a relationship with the Westminster government and the Scottish government to do it for Glasgow. And I don't think we've quite seen it since then. We need those kind of personalities. You probably need the power to attract the right people to make it happen. But I think pragmatism in the way that they've done in Manchester, I think, is the way to do it. And I mean, Manchester's got some powers that Glasgow could get, particularly through the DWP, that would actually assist on that front. So there's potential there. I think Malcolm's not wrong about, on terms of the immigration, being able, why we're not attracting the people. I think we need to understand. I'm not quite sure it's the high tax rates. I think it's probably other bits, although I do accept the differentials on tax are too large. But we also need to understand a fresh talent or a Scottish visa isn't going to deal with the demographic challenges. You're talking about much bigger numbers to deal with the demographic challenges. This is about skill shortages, about workforce shortages, and the two are different policies that require different solutions. And we also need to remember that the immigration system effectively between Ireland and Britain relies on a consistent policy across both in order to have the free travel area, the common travel area. So if Scotland diverges too much, that creates a tension as well on that front. So there's a number of different challenges on there. But I think we could improve the power of the cities to try and deal with some of these issues, particularly in the more impoverished areas.
Okay, thank you, Willie. I'd just like to bring in Peter Matheson, who's obviously been picked up on by Daniel, who said he'd like to hear economic growth and universities in the same sentence. Peter, what is it that you need from government? You know, our universities are one of the jewels in our crown, although are they doing quite as well as they could be, and are we supporting them enough, and is their structure, etc., the funding structure, what it should be? Have you got anything you'd like to tell us about your thoughts on that?
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad my comment in the chat got Daniel and Malcolm to say the word universities, because they hadn't used that word before, and Kate didn't use the word when she talked about growth. I mean, you know, I think growth obviously involves job creation, and universities are one way in which jobs are created. I mean, universities are not just skills factories. You know, at the University of Edinburgh, we've broken the record for new startups every year for the last 4 consecutive years. And 80% of the new companies that we've created are still trading. So these are creating jobs and attracting inward investment. So universities are engines of growth through the development of skills, but they're also engines of growth through new company creation. And that always seems to me to get forgotten. What can the incoming government do? They could do something on day one, Chris. They could take international students out of net migration numbers. That would make an enormous difference. International students do not behave the same as other migrants. They shouldn't be classified in the same way, in my view. And I think the rhetoric from the Westminster government in recent months has been directly responsible for creating a view that the UK is not as receptive to international students as it once was. And we've seen the numbers start to reduce. And because of the way universities are underfunded for both home students and for research and depend on cross-subsidy from international students, a small change in international student attractiveness makes a big difference to university finances. So I often hear that universities are the jewel in the crown of the UK, and they're particularly the jewel of the crown in Scotland. We know that their Scottish universities are disproportionately strong, but they're not treated like the jewel in the crown. They're treated like a sort of an appendage who could be sort of caught up in right-wing, ideology about immigration, in a sense that actually, in a way, damages the longer-term prospects of the country, because we need to attract international students, not just for the cross-subsidy. I wish we didn't depend on cross-subsidy. I wish both governments would fund universities adequately so we didn't depend on cross-subsidy, but the reality is that we do. And anything which deter those students damages both the experience for home students in our universities, but also damages the financial sustainability of the sector. Okay. So, yeah, well, that's what they could do. Take students out of net migration numbers.
Yeah. Kate.
Absolutely. So, removal of post-study work visa meant that students weren't coming here in the first place. And I think that it being narrow, being quick. It's about being too insular, thinking that the rest of the world cares about what we do because the rest of the world has alternatives in terms of Canada, America, and Australia, or whatever, in terms of universities. So one of our great selling points in Scotland is just the brilliance of our universities. Point taken around funding and finance. I think there's a little detour that could go into there just about the public finances and the challenges and what Labour need to do about our public finances, because we are under immense pressure. They're keeping expectations low. The figure that I'm using, which is on a different area in the NHS, is that Labour have talked about £134 million for the Scottish NHS. Through the Conservative government's last year's budget, we got £237 million. So it is going to be challenging. That's not a dig at Daniel, it's just the reality of
it. Is, but the 130 is additive to what
precisely
already come through. So I mean, sometimes these are compared, but it's on top of. But precisely. Yeah, I take the broader point.
Labour have made it a selling point that they are going to manage our public finances carefully and prudently. But the wider problem is that there just isn't enough for all the services that we care about immensely. And personally, I think that our universities and colleges should be right at the forefront, along with the number of students that we attract here and then keep here in Scotland. Thanks.
Let me just come to Willie on this before I come to you, Daniel. Willie, so obviously, as we talked about earlier, your party got in a bit of trouble on tuition fees. Now, it may not be that tuition fees is the right answer, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we are managing our student population and what they do and don't pay currently. Do you think the system's sustainable as it is in Scotland?
No, it's not, and it's under more pressure than it is in England. Although England is in severe trouble with some of its institutions who are on the verge of collapse. We're not quite in that position, but overall the situation is still pretty extreme. The cross-subsidy from international students is excessive, and it wouldn't take much of a global shock in order to have a direct impact on Scottish institutions. So though Peter's right about about the taking students out of the immigration numbers, there is a vulnerability that comes with that, and that's because we are overexposed to international students, because education and research is underfunded, as Peter will know, within the Scottish institutions, because there is a significant investment in the tuition fees element. And there is an issue about some students accessing Scottish universities. So there's a basket of issues there. For me, obviously, it's really difficult to open the discussion on those issues, but there is no doubt the funding arrangement we've got just now isn't sustainable, tied in with the way that we're treating colleges, because there is a unique Scottish route to higher education through our colleges, which I think we're quite rightly proud of. We managed to get young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into higher education through the college route initially, but they've been savaged in the last 12 years and they are really struggling. 4 of them are on the verge of collapse. We don't know quite which ones, but they are in significant difficulty because colleges don't have the oomph, they don't have the political weight that perhaps other parts of the education system do, but they are really critical for upskilling, reskilling, but also just developing skills for young people for the renewable sector and other sectors as well. So I think we're going to have to look at all of that. It's a sensitive area because it's highly political, but it needs to be looked at if we're going to invest in sustainable economic growth, which we're all striving for, because the universities are really important for that, along with the colleges. So, we should look at it, but yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to just move on to another question now. David Alexander, you posted about one of the things that the British government has been doing in Scotland, to some success, I think, which is the regional growth deals. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, we've been fortunate to be involved in a number of initiatives across Scotland that have aspects of their funding coming from regional growth deals. But I wondered if the panel had a perspective on the level of effectiveness of the regional growth deals in actually growing regions, as opposed to, I think, to quote Kate, John Swinney has said we need to be doing more and writing less. And certainly we have seen a significant volume of meetings, reports, landscape reviews, plans, processes, and it takes a very, very long while for anything tangible to come out of it. So I wondered what the perspective of an area where Westminster and the Scottish Government and the regions in Scotland have been working together, and whether we've got the balance between the talking and the writing and the doing. So that was my thought, because we see it on the front line all the time.
Thank you. Malcolm, you obviously were at the Scotland office for a fair period of time. So
yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, that was a key part of my portfolio in my 2 years in the Scotland office. And you're right, it's been a very significant amount of funding. It's $3 billion in total. It's come direct from Westminster, but not dictated by Westminster. It's basically it's been bid for by the local communities. Now, what's really interesting to me is that it's basically, I think this is a precursor to real devolution. You know, we haven't really had devolution from Westminster to Edinburgh. We haven't had devolution from Edinburgh to the rest of Scotland. And this is, I think, the first chapter of this. My ex-colleague Ian Stewart wrote a very interesting booklet on this. If you take the Glasgow City Region deal, that's 8 local authorities receiving £1.8 billion. If you take the South East Scotland, the City of Edinburgh deal, that's 4 local authorities. These are, certainly if you take the West of Scotland one, my town of Greenock and Inverclyde is now part of the Glasgow City Region. And the conversation is now being had in Inverclyde on a West of Scotland basis. This is now, it's not just parochial local stuff, it's how do we advance the cause for this whole region. And it's had a very significant impact. And if you talk, I mean, these big projects, whether it's a supercomputer in Edinburgh, whether it's the National Robotorium and Heriot Watt, you know, the whole manufacturing MFI in Glasgow, you know, I'm not going to go through them all. But even when it comes to some of what you might call the more cosmetic issues, so for example, 55 million given to Inverclyde, of which 20 million is to clean up the town centre, goes a long way, makes people feel a lot better, a lot more proud. When these cruise ships come in, they've now got, instead of being marched through the container terminal onto a bus to Glasgow, they've actually got a reasonable, nice town to actually explore and visit. And so actually you find that local people want this, they want more of it. All the evidence tells us that they want more, not less. In fact, on the 32 local authorities, I probably got round to having detailed discussions with 25 of them. And they, whichever party they were, SNP, Labour, whoever it might be concerned, they said, this is the most interaction we've had with London since devolution, 25. From you, we're getting enthusiasm, we're getting engagement, and we're getting money. We don't get that from Scottish Government and Holyrood, okay? We want more of it, not less. Even the wee guy, even Councillor Bremner, I can quote him in Inverclyde, when we gave him money to help him sort out the ferry to Strontian, I said I'd do it as long as he put a Union Jack on the side, okay? He said he might paint it on the pier, that's about the best of it, okay? But the reality is, he wants that money. He doesn't care where it comes from. And the fact is, it's local people deciding what's best in their community. And we need more of it, not less.
And Daniel, is that something that you'd expect to continue under it? Will there be rocket boosters put under that? Big Union Jacks on the side of the rocket boosters? What's the...
I think I'm not privy to our livery policies for our kind of funding mechanisms. Look, I'm going to say yes and no and do a classic politician's answer to this. Look, I think the city region deals have been good. I think some of the things that Malcolm has pointed out, I think, are correct in terms of, you know, that facilitating a kind of a genuine dialogue between different levels of government. I think having very clear outcomes goals, but I think, you know, there are issues with the way that they were put together. You know, some of them were put together very quickly. I think it's fair to say there are, I think, mixed views between the different city region deals. I think some have worked very well, others less so. I mean, I think it's really interesting, for example, the Edinburgh one, it's great that it includes, for example, the university, and the university has played a really pivotal role, but I don't think they've all been born equal. I think we need to look quite carefully, and I think measuring and having a look at the impact is really important. But it also needs to be joined up, because at the moment we don't really have a coherent locus for regional governance in Scotland. And regional economic development is absolutely the nuts and bolts of building an economy. You know, it's at that regional level about how cities work with their surrounding areas, through the infrastructures, through the planning, that you actually genuinely can build economic development. So we have, on the one hand, city region deals, we've got regional economic partnerships elsewhere. You know, in the meantime, you've got, other kind of locuses for this. I actually think we need a coherent approach to regional economic development. I think the combined authorities in England actually do provide a model. And here's the thing, and I went down in February to just meet with Andy Burnham and his team, and it is just a different way of delivering. And the glib way I've put this is that we showed up at their office and we sort of took a step back because we realised that Andy Burnham only has one floor in his building. This is not a model that is built on creating kind of huge bureaucracies and multiple agencies. This is actually about knitting different parts of the system together. Actually, it's much more about having a plan and coordinating different agencies and different levels of government towards that plan, rather than creating kind of edifices and bureaucracy in and of itself. And I think that's part of the secret sauce as to what's going on. And ultimately, I think we need to take a step back. What makes Scotland distinctive? And it's partly, we have kind of actually quite an extraordinary set of assets across the Central Belt, right next door to huge wide open spaces, and right next door to a massive offshore renewables potential. It's only by, I think, that having kind of coherent regional economic development, coherent regional governance, that we'll actually be able to put the plans in place, the investment in place, the infrastructure in place, to make good on those elements and actually join up rural and urban economies. So, I think, this is just why we are really very serious and very keen to look at combined authorities and taking that forward for and implementing it in Scotland.
Okay. Willie, last word to you then, because
So I want to go back to something that Kate said early on, which I was impressed with, which is less documents, more doing. And I think because businesses find it really difficult. They find government, local government, national government often impenetrable. They don't quite know how to navigate it, and they want clarity. They want communications. They want to know who it is that fixes things. It's not all just about money. It's about the connections. It's about breaking down the barriers. But they see government often as a barrier to growth. And that's where I think that saying less, doing more, building relationships, forcing the different local authorities to work together, whether it's money that brings them together or not, that's, I think, the key to an awful lot of this. How do we get the big businesses to come here? How do we grow what we've got? All of that is critical in terms of government and how it performs. There's something that Ivan McKee said to me before. I think, in fact, it was a speech he made in the Parliament, that businesses look at press releases from government and they think, is that a new policy? Or is that just something that's been announced before? And they have to spend a long time navigating it. Let's make it simple for them so that they can do what they do best, which is grow, create jobs, and make growth for the country.
Thank you. Well, that's us out of time, slightly over time. I'm very grateful to the four of you for giving us time in what's a very, very busy period for you. At least we're nearly there, and on Friday we'll know roughly what things look like for the future, and you will all be able to put down your cudgels for a very short period over the summer before we start it all again in the run-up to 2026. So I hope you're able to get a rest, and I hope the election result is as close to what you'd all like it to be, although that can't obviously be the case for all of you. But thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming along today and joining us, and we shall see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Good.